Hello everyone, my name is Maximilian Hils. I'm a PhD student at the University of Innsbruck in Austria, and today I would like to present joint work with Daniel Woods and Rainer Böhme. The paper we are talking about is titled Measuring the Emergence of Consent Management on the Web. If you have been living in the European Union for the last couple of years, you have probably come along those cookie dialogues plenty of times. Likewise, if you live in California, you have probably seen them pick up since the beginning of 2020 on your websites. This dialog here presents you with two options. One of them is I accept, the other one is I do not accept. Other dialogs give you different options. They still have that big highlighted accept button, but then come with a more options button. If you click that button, you're typically presented with a very fine-grained controls over your cookie settings. Now, those dialogs are the subject of our research, and we call them consent dialogs. In the first part of our talk, I would briefly like to talk about what consent management actually is. Then we go over to our method, where we used longitudinal web scraping to measure the emergence of those dialogs on the web. And finally, we look at the results from those measurements before we conclude. You all know that many websites on the internet are financed by advertisements. The way that usually works is that you as a user visit a publisher's website. That publisher embeds some third-party ad tech companies, and those ad tech companies are the ones serving you advertisements and share revenue with the publisher. This model has been around for years, but what has recently changed in Europe is that with the inception of the General Data Protection Regulation, those ad tech vendors are now required to ask users for consent before they can build user profiles to serve you tailored ads. This has changed the advertising landscape quite a bit, and what emerged is a standardized framework to handle user consent in the ad tech industry. Most parts of this new ad tech infrastructure are invisible to you as the user. But the one part that is clearly visible to you is the so-called consent management provider, or short CMP. This CMP is responsible for showing you consent dialogs, like the one I showed you earlier. They then collect your consent and distribute your consent decision to all partnering ad tech vendors. Behind this whole system, very much invisible to you, is an advertising standard created by the IAB, the Internet Advertising Bureau Europe. The IAB created the so-called Trust and Consent Framework, and as part of that framework maintains the global vendor list. The global vendor list is a list which includes all ad tech companies that play within this framework. As part of that, all ad tech vendors register with the IAB and declare for which purposes they would like to process data. This data is then compiled together by the IAB, distributed to consent management providers, and this is the data you actually see in those consent dialogues if you click on more information. Additionally, the IAB maintains consensu.org as a shared domain for all CMPs, which can be used to share consent cookies with other publishers. The idea here is that you accept cookies on one domain for all vendors in the global vendor list, and that consent decision can then be reused on other websites, so that other websites which do not require any specific purposes for themselves can just reuse existing consent to continue building your user profile. As you see, there's the CMP, which is the visible part to you, but below that there's a huge ecosystem in the ad tech industry. What we're doing in our paper is we try to observe that ecosystem at different points within. First, we can observe how ad tech vendors adopt this framework and join the global vendor list. We can see when they register with the IAB, and we can see what kind of purposes they declare for data processing. The second part is we can see by tracking the open web how content management providers are adopted by publishers. And finally, we can look at individual content management providers and see what kind of dialogues they serve to users. Our methodological approach for the majority of this paper is based on longitudinal web measurements. And before we continue to our results, I would like to spend a few words on that. If we look at the existing literature, we will see that there's plenty of excellent related research where folks have looked at consent dialogues and changes post GDPR. However, one thing almost all of those papers have in common is that they do at one point in time snapshot measurements of the open web. So they take a particular top list like the Tranco 10K, crawl that at one specific point in time, and then report their measurements on that. What we will see in our paper is that the point in time where you measure actually matters very much. So to make statements about the adoption of those technologies, it really is helpful to measure continuously since the inception of GDPR. If we just take one content management provider alone, Quantcast, as an example, they have changed their content dialogue in the last 2 years over 30 times. And that just shows the dynamic in this ecosystem. If you just measure at one point in time, you often lack context that can be established by measuring longitudinally. For this research, we have used the Netograph measurement platform. The way this platform works is that it continuously ingests posts from Twitter, Reddit, and other social media sources, then extracts all URLs out of those posts, and distributes them to web crawlers in US and EU cloud data centers. Each URL is then visited by a Chrome headless browser, and for every capture, a whole bunch of metadata such as request headers or cookies is stored. Crucially, the platform does not store full request or response bodies due to the very high volume of URLs. So at the moment, Netograph ingests about 5 million URLs per month. All these captures are then stored in a single database where they can be queried easily. In addition to the main Netograph platform, we also set up a parallel top list based measurement. Here we crawled the Tranco 10K from the University of Innsbruck as the vantage point, and given the much smaller size, we were able to retain all request and response bodies. Finally, for our analysis, we combine those captures and use both sources. Of course, it's important here that we normalize our results by top list, because Netograph itself highly oversamples popular domains or domains that are popular on social media websites. If we only look at the differences between our two parallel data pipelines, we can already observe some quite interesting phenomena. For instance, here in this table, we show how often we observe a specific content management provider depending on the configuration of our crawler. If you look at the very right column, you will see our web crawler using a German user agent crawled from the University of Innsbruck. And we see that we have 925 websites for which we can uniquely identify the use of a content management provider. If we change the user agent but remain at our university vantage point, we see that those results do not change that much. But if we now instead do those measurements using Netograph's main platform based in Google Cloud, you will suddenly see that there's a drop of about 10% of coverage, which we lose because those crawlers are either blocked because of bot protections or blocked because the IP space is misattributed to be non-European Union. If we go further and go to the US and crawl from the US, we will only observe about 80% of content providers in our dataset, just for the fact that lots of those content management providers do some form of geolocation in the back end, and they will not serve you a constant dialog if you are outside of the European Union. To cut a long story short, I think we have a very powerful measurement instrument at hand, just because Netograph has a massive number of captures dating back to 2018. On the other hand, we also have to be careful interpreting those results, because crawl location matters a lot for our use case. So just doing privacy GDPR crawls from the US would not work at all in this context. I have already thrown some numbers in the room here, but let's look at the content management ecosystem longitudinally. If you recall from the slide, there are quite a few places where we can measure this ecosystem. And for the first set of our results, we want to focus on how publishers embed content management providers on the internet. This graph shows the adoption of specific CMPs in the Tranco 10K over time. If we look at this graph without much context, we can first observe three distinct periods of change. The first one is the introduction of GDPR in the middle of 2018. And then we have at the beginning of 2020, the introduction of CCPA, and in the middle of 2020, the CCPA enforcement date. So here it shows very clearly that those legal events have clear impacts on the adoption of content management technology. And at the same time, the impact very much depends on the providers. So we see that OneTrust profited heavily from CCPA, whereas Quantcast, one of the content management or the content management leader beforehand, has not really picked up steam with that. We can also look at this data from a different perspective, namely at the adoption of CMPs by websites Tranco rank. What we find here is quite striking. The top 100 websites in the Tranco top list almost universally don't adopt CMPs, whereas CMPs are widely adopted by the mid-tier of websites in the Tranco 1000 to 5000. The reason for that, we think, is that large websites have the resources to deploy their own content management solutions, whereas those mid-tier publishers are mostly forced to use existing CMPs. Another interesting observation from our longitudinal measurements is how websites switched between content management providers over time. Here in this transition graph, for example, we see that Cookiebot is kind of like an entry drug to the content management provider market. They lose a lot of customers to Quantcast and OneTrust, and at the same time, not many other websites switch from those services back to Cookiebot. Another way to look at the content management ecosystem is to look at the behavior of ad tech vendors in this. And if you recall our figure from the beginning, you see those two red pipes here at the bottom. First, we see vendors initially signing up for the IAB framework. And second, we can take a look at which purposes are declared by vendors to actually process data, what their intention for data processing is. Let's look at the adoption of the IAB framework by ad tech vendors first. If you take this graph and compare it to the content management provider market share in the Tranco 10K we had a few slides ago, you will see it is much less eventful. There's a big increase in vendors around 2018 when GDPR happened, but since then, this list has pretty much stayed constant. There's a small continuous increase in the number of vendors, but overall, the global vendor list has not changed that much. You also see some lines for specific purposes that are requested for data processing. And also here, we do not see any global trends. It pretty much stays the same share over time. So knowing that, we can take a bit of a closer look at which purposes are actually requested in which way. Here we have a result that requires a bit of explanation. Under the IAB's framework, vendors can either seek consent for specific data processing purposes, or they can declare that they have a legitimate interest in those data processing purposes. Legitimate interest here refers to a very specific clause in the GDPR, and the main idea is that if a vendor declares they have legitimate interest, they can continue processing personalized data even if the user does not consent to any form of data processing. This makes a lot of sense if you think about, for example, fraud prevention, but the IAB's framework allows you to claim legitimate interest for any of the purposes defined in the first version of the framework. If we look at this graph, we see that a bit more than 200 vendors seek the user's consent for the purpose of measurement, which refers to any kind of usage, statistics, and tracking. At the same time, there are also about 150 AdTech vendors which claim they have a legitimate interest in tracking usage statistics, which means even if you go to the trouble in the consent dialog of saying reject all, opt out to all, these companies claim they still have a legal ground to process your personal data, and they will continue doing so. If we look at the development of the global vendor list over time, we can also spot cases where vendors have extended the number of purposes for which they seek consent, or where they switched from seeking consent to claiming a legitimate interest. Most of these changes are not very significant, with maybe the only exception is purpose 1, information storage and access. In that case, many vendors switched from claiming a legitimate interest to seeking consent. This is a reaction to US legislation stating that you cannot declare legitimate interest for that purpose, but have to seek users' consent. In the much newer version 2 of the IAB's framework, vendors in fact can only seek consent for that purpose. Here we still see a large number of vendors claiming legitimate interest, even though under US law interpretation, this should not be the case. Finally, we can turn to users and their perception of consent management providers. If you recall from our pipeline figure in the beginning, the CMPs are actually the ones responsible for showing consent dialog to users. For this paper, we have looked at the time it takes users to complete consent dialogs. We have embedded the consent dialog of Quantcast, the then leading CMP provider, onto a website we control in 2 different configurations. First, we used Quantcast's default settings, which included a reject all and a accept all button. And second, we changed one setting in that dialog to display a more options button instead of a reject all button. If we look at the results, we can see that if there's a direct reject all button, there's only a very, very small, still significant, but very small time difference for users to pick either option. If, however, we have a more options button, we can see that it takes users significantly longer to opt out. Maybe the more interesting part is, even if we have a direct reject all button, we see the large majority of users clicking accept all, probably because they're at this point habituated to just accept those dialogues because it's the fastest way for them to go away. There are more extreme examples, of course. This is the consent dialog we found on Forbes.com, which is hosted by TrustArc, another CMP we looked at. If you click on accept on this dialog, it of course closes immediately. But if you click on more info and then click on submit preferences, it lets you wait a median time of 17 seconds before it completes. Well, complete is relative because it also tells you that, well, this website is hosted using HTTPS, and the HTTPS protocol cannot be used to send opt-out requests to some of its vendors. So you click another link, you click more info again, you click submit preferences again, and then it makes you wait another 17 seconds before it completes. Even more insulting, it then tells you that for some vendors, opt-out requests could not be processed due to your cookie settings, even though we had this running with default cookie settings. Altogether, it should become really clear here how users are trained to just click accept all without making a proper privacy choice. There are, of course, many other ways how consent dialogues can incur a high cost to users. On this disturbing example on an Italian website, we found a Quantcast dialog weighting it at 151 megabytes. This code is loaded on every page load and of course makes for a quite unacceptable browsing experience, specifically on mobile devices. Before we get too angry with CMPs, let's take a look at the main conclusions of our paper. The first big takeaway, I think, is that consent management has seen a significant uptake in recent years. As of September 2020, we can find popular CMPs on about 17% in the Tranco 10K, which is quite a significant share of websites. The second part is we think we really need longitudinal measurements in this space. Just having snapshot measurements just provides very little context on the surrounding factors and influences. Our third takeaway is that even when you are a very privacy sensitive user and you always click through those dialogues and suffer and manage to reach the reject all button, even then many vendors will still continue to process your personal data because they claim a legitimate interest for that. And finally, we hope the last few examples in our paper give you an idea that users can really suffer when they opt out. With that being said, I thank you for your attention. My name is Maximilian Hils, and this was joint work with Daniel Woods and Rainer Böhme from the University of Innsbruck.